مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. غنى فرانك سيناترا قائلا: الحب والزواج، الحب والزواج يسيران معا كالعربة وحسان. ربما كان ذلك حقيقيا ذات مرة، ولكنه لم يعد كذلك، وخاصة في أمريكا. معدلات الزواج تتراجع، وعدد الأطفال الذين يولدون لآباء وأمهات غير متزوجين يرتفع. وفي حين أن لهذا علاقة بالأصل العرقي والفقر، فإن هذه الظاهرة لا تقتصر على الشباب، إنها تبرز في كل مكان وبين الجميع. وبسبب هذه التغيرات الأساسية، فإن المجتمع الأمريكي وثقافته وشؤونه السياسية تتغير كذلك. لمناقشة مسائل عدم المساواة والفقر والأعراق ومستقبل الزواج في أمريكا، يسرني أن أرحب بواحدة من أكثر الخبراء الاقتصاديين والأكاديميين احتراما في أمريكا اليوم، وهي دكتور إيزابيل سوهيل. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. We're sitting in the Brookings Institution here in Washington, and I'm joined by Dr. Isabel Sawhill. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Inequality in America, getting worse or getting better?
Getting worse. We've had a long-term trend here of rising income inequality in the U.S., going back to the late 1970s. And it doesn't seem to be letting up very much. In fact, this latest recession that we began in 2007 has certainly not helped things.
And how should one understand the phenomenon of inequality? What does it mean to an average person?
Well, that's a good question, and maybe one way to think about it is, what are the incomes of people at the top of the income scale relative to those at the bottom? How big is that spread? And that spread has been getting larger and larger. And the biggest gaps are between those who are what you might call comfortably well off, upper middle class, and the truly rich, the very, very wealthy. That gap has grown the most, particularly in the last couple of decades.
You mean the really rich have gotten really, really rich?
Really, really rich. Really moved far away from even the sort of just ordinary rich.
And what's the simple explanation for this, if one exists?
Well, we don't have perfect answers here, especially for this last mentioned phenomenon. I think it has something to do with the fact that compensation packages in corporations and for various celebrities and so forth have gotten way out of balance with what's reasonable and what's necessary. But it may also be because the very best talent in our society is now in huge demand and can command these very high compensation packages. A little lower in the distribution, forgetting about the truly wealthy for the moment, I think what's going on is that we have increased demand for people with high levels of education and skill, and the supply has not kept pace, and the people who don't have a lot of education or skill are falling behind, whereas those with a lot of education, especially people with a college degree, are still doing pretty well in the labor market.
So let's talk for a minute about those people at the other end of the spectrum. Poverty in America, getting worse or getting better?
Well, it ticked down just slightly recently because of the end of the recession. In the last year or so that we have data for. But before that, it had been increasing as a result of the high rates of joblessness that we had in the U.S. from after 2007, and we've had high rates of unemployment through most of this recovery until recently. So that's been a big problem. But before that, there's a longer-term trend that wasn't positive either. So this is not just a very recent phenomenon. It's just gotten a little worse recently.
And in your research, is race connected to poverty, or because it's commonly viewed that way, or is it actually not the case?
No, I think that there is a tremendous connection between race and poverty. African Americans are very disproportionately poor, so they suffer from whatever disadvantages race brings, and it does bring some on its own, but they also suffer from the fact that they tend to be at the very bottom of the income distribution, less educated, less well positioned in the job market, and so forth.
A subset of this, let's just talk for a minute about kids. Kids in poverty, that specific aspect, is that getting worse?
Kids are have very high rates of poverty. A lot of that is because many of them now are growing up in single-parent families, and single-parent families are 4 or 5 times as likely to be poor as a two-parent family. So there's a problem there, and that has been getting worse in the sense that we have far more single-parent families than we did, say, 30, 40, 50 years ago.
So I want to ask you to repeat that because it went by and it's such a powerful statement. Single-parent families are 4 to 5 times
more likely to be poor.
And therefore the kids of those families.
So therefore the kids in those families have high rates of poverty. But the other reason that kids tend to be poorer than other Americans is because when you're a child, your family is still young by definition, and younger families are not doing as well as older families. You know, the baby boom generation, the generation that is, let's say, in their 60s right now, has done very well economically. Some younger generations are not doing as well.
Did the baby boom generation do as well when they were 20 and 30 years old?
Yes.
They're doing better than...
That's complicated to answer, but I would say that they were at least doing as well. If you compare the current generation of young men in particular to what someone at their age would have earned when they were young themselves, today's young men are not earning as much as their father's generation. The women are doing better. The women are doing a lot better.
But then this is, in some sense, I gather, I would assume, is connected to the single parent.
Well, the reason the women are doing better is because women have gotten more education, they've gotten more experience, they're much better positioned in the job market now, they're moving into higher paid professions and jobs. There are more of them that are doctors and lawyers, and they are not facing the kind of occupational segregation that they did when I was a young woman. When I was a young woman, the most popular occupations for women, and the ones that were available to them, were being a secretary, maybe being a domestic, maybe being a librarian, maybe being a waitress. But I mean, the high-level jobs were not generally open to women in the same way they are today. And women weren't as educated and as experienced.
So let's take a look. If we put this all together as a package, inequality, poverty, children's poverty, how much of this reality is government's fault, or is government responsible for it, as opposed to just how society develops?
Well, I think that your views about what government should or shouldn't be doing about the poor is going to vary a lot depending upon your politics and your value system. And I can say that the U.S. doesn't do as much as most European countries, for example, about the poor. We don't have as many anti-poverty programs. We don't spend as much on that. So we have a rather skimpy set of programs, a safety net that helps the poor, but it does help them. I mean, the poverty rate, absent the programs that the government is funding, would be much, much higher than it is. So there's no question that those programs lift a lot of people who would otherwise be poor out of poverty. We've done a particularly good job with the elderly. Our pension system, called Social Security, has reduced the poverty rate amongst the elderly from something like 35% to something like 10% or less than that. So, you know, these programs have done a lot.
And so, do you think that generally we've gotten our priorities right in how we spend our money on the overall package of social services and helping poor?
Well, my personal view is that we're a very wealthy country and that we could afford to do more for those who are not doing well. But I would also favor structuring that assistance in a way that encourages people to become self-sufficient, to become more independent, to get their income through work, for example, rather than through welfare. And we have, as a country, moved somewhat in the direction of encouraging self-sufficiency, encouraging work in particular, compared to, say, even 10 or 15 years ago. We reformed the welfare system, our cash assistance program, in the mid-1990s, and we said to women on welfare, they were mostly women, you must work, and we're only going to allow you to get this welfare payment for a limited portion of time. That was very controversial, but I think it was the right thing to do, especially since we replaced it to some extent, or to a large extent, with wage subsidies that go to that same group if they're working. The difference is that instead of getting money for, unconditionally, just for being low income, you now only get the money if you have a job, and you get more money the more you work. And that program has grown, that wage subsidy program, which we call the Earned Income Tax Credit, because it's paid to people, to families, as a refund in the tax system. That is a very large program now, and can provide as much as $5,000 or $6,000 a year to a low-income family.
Okay, when we come back with Isabel Sawhill, we're going to talk about love and marriage, and are we on the right track with these core institutions in our country? In just a moment. My guest today is Dr. Isabel V. Sawhill. She's a senior fellow in economic studies here at the Brookings Institution in Washington. She serves as co-director of the Budgeting for National Priorities Project and co-director for the Center on Children and Families. Prior to joining Brookings, Dr. Sawhill was a senior fellow at the Urban Institute. Previously, she served as associate director of the Office of Management and Budget, where she oversaw all the human resource programs of the federal government, accounting for 1/3 of the entire federal budget. Her research has spanned a wide array of economic and social issues, including fiscal policy, economic growth, poverty and inequality, welfare reform, and the well-being of children, changes in the family. Dr. Sawhill helped to found the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy and now serves as president of its board. She is the author of this new book, Generation Unbound: Sex and Parenthood Without Marriage. She attended Wellesley College and received her doctorate from New York University. So, Dr. Sawhill, marriage. Is this institution dying in America, or is it thriving in America?
Well, it's a hard question to answer, but I just wrote a whole book on the topic, and I'm somewhat pessimistic after reviewing all the data on this. Marriage rates have been plummeting, and the youngest generation is either delaying marriage until they're in their late 20s, early 30s, or not marrying at all. And the problem is that they haven't stopped having children. So we have a very large proportion of all children in America now being born outside of marriage. For those under 30, it's about 50% now of all children, about half of all children born outside of marriage. Some of them are living with the child's father at the time of the birth, but they often split up after a few years, and then you have a single-parent family, and those families don't tend to do terribly well economically. They are much more likely to be poor or low income than a two-parent family.
What have been the major triggers for this huge change in marriage rates and unwed pregnancies?
I think probably the most important thing is that there's just been a change in social norms and attitudes. It used to be that if you had a child outside of marriage, that was stigmatized, that you were going to be at risk of a lot of disapproval from your friends and family. That's not really true anymore. It's now much more acceptable. In addition, I think women have far more opportunities to support themselves than they used to, and don't so closely identify with just being wives and mothers, so they don't need marriage as much as they used to. A third factor has been that the earning ability of less educated men in particular has declined, so they don't look like great marriage partners to a lot of women.
There's no analog in our history with this, even close to this percentage of teenage pregnancies, or
yeah, it's not just teenage. It's
just unwed.
It's just unwed. Actually, the teenage pregnancy and birth rate has come down. But yeah, no, I don't think there's any precedent for this. We're in uncharted waters here, and so it's a whole new environment for the raising of children, and I think it has having some negative effects on kids. Kids, I think, are better off. All the research suggests that kids are better off when they have two parents than when they only have one. But it's a little too soon to tell where all of this is going. I wouldn't want to make any solid predictions about it. But I'm not optimistic that the marriages of the sort we were used to in the past are going to come back.
Do you see any other institutions replacing it, or any social conventions that will become popular and accepted?
What I argue in my recent book, Generation Unbound, is that what the old norm used to be, don't have a child outside of marriage. You know, that was just a unwritten rule. I think the new unwritten rule or norm that we need to move towards is don't have a child until you're in a committed, stable relationship with another person, and when you yourself feel really ready to become a parent. In other words, don't have a child just because you happen to be in a relationship and having sex and got pregnant accidentally.
On this set of issues, marriage, unwed pregnancies, etc., what's the proper role for government in your view?
I think that we've experimented with what are called marriage education programs. They were very popular during the Bush administration. They've now been evaluated. They didn't move the needle very much, and so even conservatives are to some extent giving up on that solution. The new popular antidote is to help less educated men earn more and have better jobs so that they can afford to support a family, and so they will become more marriageable. I'm not sure that most women are looking for someone who is just a good earner. That may be a proxy for someone that has other attributes that are valuable: reliability, trustworthiness, etc. So I'm not sure that some of the current ideas are going to pay off very well. But my own view is that if we could stop so many accidental pregnancies, that would help a lot. These pregnancies to single adults in their 20s, and most adults in their 20s are now single, they're not getting married. 73% of those pregnancies are unintended, according to the woman herself. So if we could reduce that, then people would have a chance to get more education, to get more settled in the job market, and to find a stable partner before they had kids. So that's sort of the theme of my recent book.
And if you had one suggestion to the president in terms of a message that you would like him to emphasize, what would it be?
Kids are important. They are one of the most important decisions we ever make. It's the decision to have a child. You can divorce a spouse, but you can never divorce a child. So think carefully before you have children. Make sure that you want them and are prepared to provide them with the parenting that they need and deserve. I mean, accidents happen, but a child shouldn't be one of them.
Dr. Isabel Sawhill, thank you very much for joining us on Dakhel, Washington.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول مستقبل الزواج في بلدكم، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.